My name is Simone Latkulik. I'm head of customer success team for laboratories at Platomics, and I will guide you through today's webinar together with my colleague, David Triebel. He is head of regulatory affairs at Platomics, and he will introduce to you the topic. Hello, David.
Hello.
Now, Platomics is a Vienna-based company with lots of years of experience in diagnostic industry already. We have our aim is to transform regulatory for in vitro diagnostic and to bring innovation to patient faster. Now, risk management under the IVDR is still a challenge for diagnostic laboratories. And we will tackle this question by today's webinar. Let's have a look at the agenda. So David will talk about safety risk specifically in the laboratory. And then, of course, we'll also talk about the legal requirements for diagnostic laboratories. Then we will also talk about the ethical commitment and the risk management culture, building a culture of ethical responsibility and risk awareness. And then we will also present risk analysis methods. And last but not least, I will present the Platomics solution, the PlatoX risk management tool of our platform. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to ask your questions here in the Q&A section. We will try to answer those questions by the end of the webinar if we have enough time. But now let's start with an introduction to the topic by David.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the moderation, Simone. And also from my side, a warm hello and thank you everyone for joining. So today's topic is the safety risk in a clinical laboratory and how to establish a proper process and how to achieve regulatory compliance without providing or adding too much burden. But before we dive into the topic in more detail, maybe also triggering why we are holding this webinar and why we are doing what we're doing at Platomics. We have gathered some feedback from customers that we are working with, some laboratory challenges that they are facing, that you are facing on a daily basis. So on the one hand, we have two big groups of challenges, kind of. There is always the resources that are available versus the workload. That's the big topic, kind of. So the workload is always increasing with more testing volumes, with costs that need to be reduced. And at the same time, there are problems, of course, or there are some issues that just come up on a daily basis. Just things that happen, like downtime of lists or instrument calibration that all affects the daily work and the daily business. And on top of that, on top of the daily work, comes these regulatory expectations, the regulatory challenges, the new requirements that are set upon labs. And thereby one part of it is risk management. And what Simone will show at the end of the presentation, and that's intended to make the gap kind of from theory to praxis, what we want to do or what we're doing at Platomics, is we want to use the information that you already have in the laboratory and to introduce a small framework around it to make everything compliant. And today we're focusing very much on risk management, as the title also indicates. So let's dive into, so what's today's topic? We are talking today about safety risk. And from a regulatory point of view, it is the safety risk. This term is defined from two components. So it's the combination of a probability of occurrence of a harm and the severity of that harm. So it's always this duality that something bad kind of happens, and how bad can it actually be? And the combination of this is what we call a risk. Now, what we are focusing today is not business risks, is not IT risks. We're focusing on three big groups, basically. We're focusing on the patient, on risks that are towards the patient, towards the users, so to the laboratory personnel that are using the test, the in-house device or the CE device. Same goes for CE devices. And also for other persons, so for people that might be affected if something goes wrong. So if we look at the example of a COVID test, for example, the patient, the person receiving the test result, is always in danger of getting a wrong result. But also the person performing the test and carrying out the test has a danger of infection, for example. So these two groups, I think, are quite clear. And the third group is a bit more difficult to grasp, but I think with COVID, it's a quite good example how that can be identified. So the third group would be the people that are then in danger or pursued or could have an harm. If the first person, so if someone receives a negative test result, thinks he's negative, and then meets vulnerable groups, for example, and they then get infected and get a bad condition, for example. So that's the central point of what a safety risk is about. And let's look at these 2 points in more detail. So we said a safety risk is the probability and the severity of a harm and the combination thereof. The risk probability, I think it's a very quite straightforward term. Basically, the risk probability is how likely is it that something bad will happen. So how likely is the harm to occur? That's the one parameter of a risk. And what we can see here is a source where we had a look what errors usually happen in a clinical laboratory in the process phases. And we can see in the pre-analytical process, there are 98.4% of errors happening in this phase and only 0.5 or 1.1% in the analytical and post-analytical phase. So a lot of risks are already in the pre-analytical phase, which needs to be addressed, of course. The other parameter that we're looking at, so we have the probability, the danger or the probability that something will occur. And the other parameter is a bit more tricky. It's a bit complex. It's the risk severity. So how bad is the harm that can actually happen if something goes wrong with the test? And this is usually divided into subgroups or sub parameters. So we have here on the bottom corner, you can see 5 different categories going from negligible to minor, serious, critical, and catastrophic. So catastrophic would in most cases be the worst case that can happen, potentially the death of a patient. If something goes wrong with the test, then it might lead to a death of the patient. Negligible can be something, for example, that is just an inconvenience or a temporary discomfort that a patient or that a person perceives. And on this slide, you can see a study. Shows that an IV manufacturer has asked several labs to address the question what they think if something goes wrong in the diagnostic process with the test based on the analyte. How bad is the event? How bad is the harm that can actually then happen to the patient? And what we can see here is that different labs and different people have a different assessment because they also have a different view of the certain topic, and they probably look at the harm, the worst case that can happen in a bit of a different way depending on the daily workload. So we can see some elements for troponin, for example, where they are quite in line and it's more a serious event, a risk severity, either serious, critical, or catastrophic. But for other elements, like for example, for lipase, we have a negligible event or a negligible risk severity that is assessed to this problem or to this potential error. And at the same time, we have laboratories that say something catastrophic might happen. So the baseline is just, it is always a very individual assessment. So you really have to look at the test, also include all the relevant parties in the to have a very stable and a very robust process. And that's exactly the purpose of risk management. So the purpose of having a stable risk management process and involving all the people in the relevant steps is with the intention of reducing the risks and thereby reducing the potential harms or the harms for patients and for users as far as possible, as far as they can.
Now, David, what are the legal requirements now for risk management for laboratories?
Yeah, there's a good point. The legal requirements is it's a bit of a challenging question to answer in short. So I think we need some time at least, because as a consultant, you would always say it depends. And it's also the right answer actually for the legal requirements, because it entirely depends on where you're based as a laboratory, because we have national laws and we have national requirements that provide requirements for the risk management for laboratories. We have international standards that you can use in order to comply with these requirements that also impose additional requirements towards the risk management. And then on top of that, we also have the IVDR for in-house tests. So if you're using in-house tests, or if you are producing in-house tests in the laboratory, then the IVDR comes into play additionally, which is another set of requirements for risk management. So if we look at the legal requirements, that the international standards are not obligatory. So you're not, at least from the IVDR perspective, you're not obliged these standards, but there are some standards that have been established in the area of risk management for laboratories that are quite usable and that are also in use very much in praxis. So we have depicted some of them here. So the ISO 15189 for quality management that also has requirements for risk management. We have the 22367 that explicitly talks about risk management in medical laboratories, and the 5649 that explicitly mentions the in-house case, and they're all a bit interconnected. So these standards and also the CLSI guidelines give additional requirements, and they give a handbook or a kind of step-by-step guide on how a risk management can be set up in a laboratory. And the intention of that is exactly to meet the requirements of national laws, because national laws, or also the IVDR, they don't go into a lot of detail what needs to be done for risk management in praxis. So what are the real steps that you need to do? These are not covered by the IVDR or as national laws. They just say you need to have a sufficient risk management in place. And for example, if you're based in Germany, France, or Italy, there are national laws that also indirectly or directly require risk laboratory. And at the same time, we now have the IVDR. And if you have in-house devices in your laboratory, so if you use CE devices out of scope of their intended purpose, so a bit different than the manufacturer has developed them or intended them, then you fall under this IVDR Article 5.5, which is the in-house IVDs. And this article, on the one hand, asks for a suitable QMS, so for compliance with ISO 15189, which directly also requires risk management. And additionally, this article links out to the general safety and performance requirements of the IVDR that go into more detail what is actually required by risk management. So if you're in the in-house case, then the IVDR comes into place and you need to be compliant with Article 5.5. And in IVDR Annex 1, which is a small sentence in Article 5.5, but there are a lot of requirements there, and some of them go into the direction of risk management, and they directly require you to have an implemented and documented risk management system in place, with the clear aim to have safe and effective tests out there, which is the aim of the IVDR in general, and to reduce all risks that we have. And in that case, we're talking about risks towards users that use this test, that perform the test, and to others, as we had a bit before, and to reduce these risks as far as possible. So basically, these requirements of the IVDR and also of the 15189 and of national laws that might be applicable and might request you to do risk management standards can be used. On top of that part, so that is kind of this legal requirement section that we talked about, but on top of that, there is something that we titled in this webinar as the ethical commitment. So maybe we can just take a step back and not only look at the legal requirements, but also look at the reason why, and this is an important factor, why a lot of the requirements that are written down are already complied with by laboratories, because a lot of the actions that are required by the standards and by the IVDR are inherently already done by the laboratories. And maybe let's have a look why this is the case and why this is needed, highly needed. Because the influence of a test result of the work that is done in the laboratory is immense. So we have had a look at different studies, and we've checked different sources, and this is one where we found is the most robust. And it estimates that about 66% of clinical decisions, so decisions on patient how they are treated, patient treatment, is done or is guided by IVD testing. So this would result, if every test would fail, 66% of the decisions would be wrong, which luckily is not the case. So that's one sign that there's already a lot that is being done correctly. But this just shows the influence of a diagnostic test in the treatment of patients, and that's a huge impact that they have. And at the same time, we had this big number, the 66% of treatments that are guided by IVDs. And at the same time, we have an error rate of about, another study that we found is 0.6% of tests. So 1 in 200 test performances actually produce an error, which is quite low, which looks quite low. But on the other hand, there's still 1 of 14 people, so this 7.2% that we see here, of patients that experience a diagnostic error, so that experience that something goes wrong in the diagnostic section. And the difficult question that can't be answered on a general level here is what level of error can actually be considered acceptable. So it's very, very difficult to say overall what level of error can be considered acceptable. This level of error, so you will never have an error of 0. There will always be some level of error, but the difficult assessment is always how to set that level. And the good thing is, to answer that question and to support this question and the answering of this question, that's exactly the purpose of a robust and stable risk management, that you have a process in place to be able to answer the questions, what level of error can be accepted in this specific case, because it's always a case-by-case decision that needs to be taken. So overall, we have a legal framework and we have an ethical framework where we already comply with a lot of steps. So a lot of steps in the laboratory where risk mitigation measures are already in place, and we'll have a look at that later on as well. But all of these requirements are now laid out formally as well by the IVDR, by the ISO accreditation, by the 15189 and so on. And they lay out a strong number or a high number of requirements that are needed to be compliant, actually. The difficult question is, again, how to perform the robust risk management, because, which I just said, you need a risk management or a robust and stable risk management in order to be able to come to this conclusion, what level of error is needed. To answer that question, we have to dive a bit more in detail, and also into the detail why these numbers are as they are already, and what is the case therefore. So the risk management culture is very important to decide how do you want to address risks. Do you want to address risks proactively, so to look and to identify and to check what might go wrong, or retrospectively just see what goes wrong? Because luckily, we as humans we have an aversion against risks. So we try to omit risks, and it's a very common behavior. So we all try to keep the risk level as low as possible. And that's exactly why we have also these low numbers, and why I mentioned that there are a lot of actions and a lot of safety mechanisms that are already in place in laboratories, which lead to compliance. But basically, there are 2 different ways how to deal with the risks. So you have the one option of coping with risks, so waiting until something happens, until a risk occurs, until something, a harm occurs, and then reacting and finding out what has happened, defining how can you reduce that this, or how can you mitigate that this won't happen again. That's the one approach that you can do. And the other one is the very proactive and the very robust approach, where you systematically analyze risks before they happen and try to reduce the risk level before they actually occur. We have tried here to come up with some numbers, and these numbers are not from literature. I have to be quite clear about that, but these numbers are based on experience and experience working in laboratories, but also experience working with manufacturers, because manufacturers have the same topic. Manufacturers also need to identify what risks may happen, and the sooner they can address these risks and mitigate these risks, the better. So the one option, this would be the option of the reactive way. So if you get unexpected results of a test, for example, and you get the feedback from your customers and from patients that there are at least three, potentially more patients that have received a wrong result. Then the next step is, and this will happen in any laboratory, I'm very, very sure about that. The next step is through complaint management and to investigate what has actually happened. How can this happen that we have a wrong test result? And then leading back and finding out, okay, in this case, we had a different supplier. The supplier had tubes that had the same colors, but had a different color coding than was written in the SOP. So we need to update the SOP or work instruction, apply these changes to the documentation, and also train everyone that they know this is now the new, these are now the new tubes, and this is how they should be handled. So we have patients that are affected. We need time to identify what has actually gone wrong and what is the result for these wrong results, and then identify what actions to implement and what actions to do and train everyone. So that's the one case where we have the reactive process. On the other side, and this is the one that, of course, is the preferred one, because as you can see, the patients affected in that case are 0. So in that case, we have the same situation. There is a new purchase request, so we have a new supplier, and then the analysis of what that might affect and what might happen if we have a new supplier and what changes have happened from supplier 1 to supplier 2. And these color changes in the tubes, all of this is assessed beforehand. That requires time. So the time is slightly lower than before, but not significantly. And then we identify what we need to do. So the update of the documentation, the update of the work instruction, and the training of everyone, how the new process needs to be handled, which is exactly the same as before. So the saving of time in that case is not that much, but we have 0 patients affected. And that also leads to you don't have to redo the test. You don't have recalls and so on. So all of this is covered if a proactive approach is chosen or is implemented. So in that case, a risk management instead of a risk coping is always the chosen or the preferred method, because of course, initially the most obvious happening or the most obvious effect of having a proactive approach and identifying risks before they happen and mitigating them so that they don't occur is always that no patient harm will happen or no user harm in the laboratory will happen. All of this is if you cope before, or if you manage the risk before putting the test into service. So it's a proactive process, and it results in a better prevention of any risks that you have. So in any case, it's always the way to go for, or the way that it should be, that we move from this reactive process that is most likely in place everywhere to a more proactive process, to a more proactive approach to look what can we do to identify the risks and to mitigate the risks before we even put the test into service and as long as the test is used.
But how, David, can the risks be analyzed, or which methods do exist out there?
On that case, we have the benefit that risk management is not an invention of the IVDR nor of the medical device industry. risk management and risk analysis methods have been out there or are out there also for other industries. There are business risks, there are IT risks. There are very different factors and there are very different industries that perform risk analysis. And thereby there have been some methods that have been established and that everyone uses. And the methods themselves are very, very similar for all the different industries. So basically the most established ones can be broken down in three big groups. We have the first element, the user experience, and this is exactly the more reactive approach, let's say. So this is anything that you get, the feedback that you get, any information that you get when the test is in use and anything that happens, all of this is considered in the user experience. But we said we want to go away from this reactive approach to a more proactive approach to actually manage the risks and to manage the risks before anything happens. And there are two different methods to go about that, the top-down and the bottom-up analysis. These are the two ways to look at it. But let's look at these examples a bit separately. So I said user experience, this is under the label clinical user experience review. So this is all the information that is available once your test is in use. Once you perform the test, you get feedback from staff feedback. If something happens, complaint records are taken in. You have IQC and EQA records that provide you with knowledge. And you either have risk events, for example, reagent instability or degraded sample, or you already have a hazard. So we have a delayed result and we have a false positive result that can lead to a harm to the patient. So these are the elements that you have here. And all of the information that you have here is taken back in by the laboratory. And this is a method which is most likely in place in most of the laboratories already. So it's a very established one. And to back that assumption up, we've also tried to find some statistics to have that. So we have looked at how many laboratories actually monitor pre-analytical errors. So any errors that happen in the pre-analytical phase. And here we can see it's a high number. So it's 91% of laboratories that monitor these errors. That does not mean that we have a stable and a robust risk management process already in place, but this is a key element that a lot of the tasks are already done. And going further, also a lot of labs do an evaluation of any measurements, any problems that occur. So we have a statistic here of 77% of laboratories that do an irregular or a periodic evaluation on a statistical analysis of any measurements on the variables that they have in the pre-analytical phase. So it's also a very high number, 77%. And when something happens, also in that case, when they find out something goes wrong, we have a test that has considerable bad values for one or the other reason, then 76% of the labs already do an investigation and attempt or provide any steps to do an improvement and to get to a better stage and to increase the performance of the tests again. So all of these elements that we have looked at now are elements of risk management. They probably just not under the umbrella term risk management everywhere, but these are steps that are being taken by laboratories and that are being done on a daily basis, and this needs to be leveraged. And additionally to that, we also have 67% of the labs, which is still 2/3, that analyze if the changes that they have implemented to increase the performance are still monitored. So that's the reactive approach, that if something goes bad or if something does not work the way they should, and if some error occurs during the test, then this is addressed. And this is addressed in a majority of cases. That's just one element of the risk management. That is more this reactive approach that we looked at before. To move towards a more proactive approach and to manage the risks before they occur, the other two methods are or have been established more or less, and they approach the risks and the risk events from two different sides. We have the top-down approach, the fault tree analysis, where we move from the harm. So something happens to the patient. So in this case, we have example, the patient is not treated on time, and it goes further down to what has actually happened. Why is this the case that the patient has not been treated on time? It can be because of a delayed result. And a delayed result can happen because we have an operator error, we have an instrument malfunction, and so on. And then we can assess these risks with the initial values that we had at the beginning. So we said the risk always needs to be assessed with the probability, which we have at the bottom here. So you assess every happening of this tree structure with a probability, and then the harm, so the patient is not treated on time, with the severity, and that's your risk assessment in the end. And at the same time, so you have this one approach where you go from the harm to the risk event, but you can also go the other way around. You can also have a look, okay, when I perform this test in the laboratory, what can happen? What can go wrong in the practical way of working on or in performing this test? And this is more the failure modes and effects analysis, the FMEA, and this reflects the bottom-up approach, so coming from the other side. So we can have a sample mix-up, and then we can have several different problems leading from that. We can have a delayed result, we can have a false negative result, or a false positive result. And each of these, again, lead to a different harm that has a different severity score linked to it. And in the best case, so the best practice would be to combine all the three methods. So a very robust risk management system would have the user experience where you gather all the information that is out there, all the information that you get from activities that you perform already, any information that you get from customers, from users. All of this is taken into the user experience and is fed into the risk management process. And at the same time, you actively analyze risks top down and bottom up involving the relevant people. So you need people that actually know very much in detail how the steps are performed for this specific test. And on the other side, you need people that know the clinical application of the test to have the information what harm can actually occur if something goes wrong with this test. So these are the three pillars that should be used. And as said, ideally, it is always a top-down and a bottom-up, because that gives you the clearest picture of all risks that may happen with this specific test. But to sum all that up, so these are the basic steps where I look at the legal requirements that we have, the ethical requirements, but also the reason why a lot of it is already happening within the laboratory. And a lot of it is already done. There might be some small steps missing, so the documentation and all the requirements of the standards are not yet complied with, but a lot of the information is already there, and a lot of the steps are already there in the laboratory because you do it on a daily basis. And the important thing for risk management is it's an ongoing activity. So it's not performed once and then you put it on the side, but it needs to be monitored. It needs to be constantly monitored. You need to always get feedback and think, okay, if I change something, so if I have a new supplier, for example, what might happen? What could happen? Is something changed in the structure? Is something changed in the effectiveness of my test, in the result itself? So all of this needs to be handled over the full lifetime of the risk management, so over the entire process. So the risk management basically never stops unless your test is not available anymore and no one can use it and no one can get results from the test. But now we have talked, or I have talked a lot about the requirements and the general setup of a risk management. But maybe then I'll hand over to you, Simone, since we try to solve that problem and to make that problem easier with as less regulatory burden as possible with our solution. And that's exactly what you're doing on a daily basis.
Yes.
To create the
Thank you,
compliant risk
David.
management.
Thank you, David, for this really nice presentation on the different topics on risk management for laboratories. I'm happy to present you now the solution that Platomics provides for the risk management specifically for laboratories on our platform. And David, maybe go to the next slide.
Sure.
So as David said, yeah, the risk management is a process over the whole life cycle of a test, and laboratories can create the risk management file on our platform, specifically on the test label, and yeah, to document the compliance of the risk management compliance under the IVDR. The risk management solution is compatible with methods like the FMEA and the FDA method, and actually it was developed aligned to the ISO standard 22367, which is the standard for medical laboratories for risk management, and also, of course, the ISO standard 15189. The lab can, as you can see here in the screen in the middle, create the full risk management file. That means it is guided through the documentation step by step to create the risk management plan. Here, the laboratory can document the connection to the existing risk management in the lab and the quality management system. The lab also can define the different responsibilities for risk management within the laboratory, and also, of course, the risk acceptance criteria are set here that are the basis of the risk analysis. In the second step, in the risk analysis studio, the lab can analyze those risks. And we have here also a video that shows that. So risks can be added here within the studio. Probabilities can be set, controls can also be defined, and evidence documents, of course, can also be referenced to those. And then in the end, residual probabilities scores are calculated, and only if the risk is acceptable, you can proceed to create the risk management records. Last but not least, the risk management report is created. This is also done yeah, with guidance for the laboratory. And you can also proceed, David, to the last slide maybe now. The lab creates thus the full risk management file. That means a risk management plan document is created with our wizards. Then the risk management file, so the risk analysis document is created, and also the risk management report in the end. So the lab can also add those risk management files on the platform directly to the IVDR requirements of the Annex 1 of the IVDR GSPRs. Yeah, so with this, we have reached the end of our agenda for today's webinar. If you are interested in registering to our platform, you can find here the link to the Platomics lab registration from our website. Also, we have in the meantime, so we have also online seminars and trainings via our Platomics Academy that you can also register. You can find the link and the QR code also here on this slide.